When a New York woman doesn't return home from a routine errand, her husband endures a sleepless night of worry before being called to the medical examiner's office to identify her body. A case gone cold receives new scrutiny when a notorious serial killer is identified in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up, this episode contains mention of the subject of sexual assault. We won't go into any graphic detail, but still, please listen with care. Soo-ya Kim was last seen alive on June 29, 1991. She was in her 30s at the time and lived in New York City, specifically in Queens. She wasn't originally from New York, or even the U.S. Moving overseas had been a joint decision she'd made with her husband, Soo-young, almost as soon as they'd married in their original home city of Seoul, South Korea, a decade beforehand. They'd been young, ambitious, and willing to work hard in order to succeed. New York, they felt, would be the perfect place for them to build their life together. The city had a long history of immigrant success stories and was rife with opportunity, so after arriving, they settled in a small apartment and found jobs working at flea markets. However, they had bigger entrepreneurial aspirations. They wanted to open their own clothing store. Eventually, when they'd saved enough money, they did exactly that. Actually, they opened 2 clothing stores, one on Long Island and another in Brooklyn's Bushwick neighborhood. Running their own business meant working hard, from dawn till well past dusk, 7 days a week. Entrepreneurship was grueling, but they were happy. The stores had been their dream, and their hard work paid off as their customer base grew and their business thrived. Eventually, they were able to afford to move out of their small apartment and into a much more spacious one in Queens. The extra room was welcome because their business wasn't the only thing growing. Their family was as well. Soo-ya and Soo-young welcomed 2 sons into the world. According to Unsolved Mysteries episode on this case, the boys often accompanied their parents to work, particularly at the Brooklyn store. It wasn't uncommon for the entire family to be seen there. In June of 1991, Soo-ya and Soo-young celebrated a major milestone in their relationship, their 10th wedding anniversary. They'd accomplished an enormous amount during that decade of marriage, and their lives looked much different than they had when they'd exchanged vows back in Seoul. They were living the American dream and even had other family members who'd also immigrated to New York, including the boy's grandmother and Soo-ya's brother. But their hard-earned happiness didn't last. Things took a hard turn for the devastating on June 31st, just a few days after their anniversary. That day, Soo-ya went shopping. While she was gone, she left her sons at home in their apartment under their grandmother's care. Meanwhile, Soo-young was busy working at one of their stores. He got home at about 8 p.m. that evening and was surprised when he realized that he'd beaten Soo-ya home. Soo-ya never stayed out that late. Between business and family, she simply didn't have the time. She managed her time well and was not one to aberrate from her planned schedule. Still, Soo-young began making phone calls, checking with her friends, hoping that one of them would know where she was, but none of them did. Concerned, Soo-young called his wife's brother and explained the unusual circumstances. Together, they began a search for Soo-ya. They'd hardly left the Kim family apartment when they made a major discovery: Soo-ya's car. It was parked in their apartment building's garage, and, according to Unsolved Mysteries, its engine was cold, indicating that it hadn't been driven for hours. A quick note here. I don't know for sure whether Soo-ya drove her car when she went shopping that day or took public transportation. I couldn't find any clarifying information, unfortunately. The cold engine did, however, set Soo-young even more on edge, which suggests to me that she may have taken her car when she went shopping, or may have planned to. Certainly, though, there are abundant public transportation options in New York City, so it wasn't as if she would have necessarily been dependent on her car for transportation.
Yeah, I think that's really a good point, because it's not like where the rest of the U.S. where there aren't as readily available public transports and people are more reliant on their car. We really do build out our states to be very private transport related.
Sure, there are a lot of car-dependent localities in the U.S., but New York City, of course, is not really one of them. Now, if she took her car, though, its presence in the garage suggests that she either never made it to her vehicle or did, only to make it back from her outing and somehow encounter trouble. On that note, as far as I know, there were no items or shopping bags in the car from that shopping trip she'd planned. In any case, that night, Soo-young didn't sleep. Instead, he waited for Soo-ya. Hour after long hours slipped by, and when the sun finally rose, he was even more confused and concerned than he'd been the night before. Meanwhile, local police had made a disturbing discovery. Or rather, a local security guard had made a disturbing discovery and had notified police. That security guard was a man named Joe Jones, and he was employed to watch over an abandoned building in Brooklyn's Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood, which was a particularly dangerous neighborhood at the time and was located 7 densely populated miles, or a little over 11 kilometers, away from where the Kims lived in Queens. At approximately 3 a.m. on the night of Kim's disappearance, while Soo-young was up waiting for her at their home back in Queens, Joe was patrolling the building's outside perimeter when he walked up on a man dressed in a tank top and running shorts putting something in a dumpster. Joe told the guy that he was not allowed to dump anything there, and the guy paused for a moment before asking, "What if I give you $20?
Okay.
It seemed odd because when you adjust for inflation, $20 back then was worth the equivalent of nearly $50 modern dollars, which seems like a pretty steep price to pay just to unload a bag or two of garbage in a private dumpster.
The weirdness of the whole situation,
Right.
It's so necessary that he dumps in that particular dumpster at that time.
Right. Well, Joe agreed and he took the bill that the man handed to him, but as he did so, he noticed something that gave him pause. The man had blood spatter on his clothing. When Joe asked the stranger about the blood, he claimed he'd just been in a fight, but he didn't look like he'd been in one. He had no obvious injuries. Before Joe could ask anything else, the man climbed into his car, backed out, and then stopped at a corner to shoot Joe a long, weird stare before finally driving away, leaving Joe alone to wonder who and what in the world he'd just encountered.
That is definitely one of the more weird stories I've heard about.
Yeah, needless to say, it raised some red flags, and Joe was not buying the "I just got into a fight" excuse, and so, naturally, he walked over to the dumpster. On the ground, he could see a trail of blood leading straight into the dumpster. At about this time, a friend of his happened to walk by, so he called him over and he told him the whole story of what had just happened, and both men agreed. Whatever was in the dumpster was probably something they, and likely the police, needed to know about. Before calling the police, though, they wanted to be sure that they wouldn't be wasting their time, so they used a shovel to carefully push aside the top layer of the dumpster's contents, revealing a woman's hand. Immediately, they dropped the shovel and flagged down the first approaching vehicle they saw. It just so happened to be an ambulance, but there was nothing the EMTs inside could do for the woman in the dumpster. She was deceased. Police arrived on scene shortly thereafter and spoke to Joe, who told them what had happened, described the man and his vehicle, and was able to give them a partial license plate. He'd taken a mental note of that as the man had driven away.
Okay.
The car had been a blue Nissan sedan with a New York plate, and the suspect had been a slender white male, probably in his mid-20s, with blonde hair, blue eyes, and glasses. For anyone interested in seeing a suspect sketch that was created based off of Joe's description, we've posted it on our website. The link is in the show notes. With that information to go on, homicide investigators immediately got to work. When they searched for blue Nissan sedans with the same partial plate, there was only one match.
Okay, that's pretty legitimate.
Right, there were plenty of vehicles that had that partial plate, but only one blue Nissan. However, the registered owner was not the white male suspect that Joe had described. Rather, she was a Taiwanese exchange student studying at CW Post College on Long Island.
Okay.
Naturally, investigators sought her out and asked about her car. She said she'd last driven it the night before, returning home and parking it by 10 o'clock. When police examined the car, there was no blood on the interior or exterior, and the engine was cold, indicating that it hadn't been driven for at least a couple hours. When questioned by a detective, the owner denied letting anyone borrow her car or even there being a second set of keys in existence. The lead, as promising as it had seemed, was looking like a dead end. Investigators were back at square one. Meanwhile, investigators had reached out to Soo-young, asking him to come to the medical examiner's office in order to identify his wife's body. Soo-young didn't even want to entertain the possibility that his wife might be deceased, but when the investigator pulled back the sheet, there was no denying it. The body was Soo-ya's. For Soo-young, the world ended with that pulled back sheet. He later explained how that moment in the medical examiner's office had felt to Unsolved Mysteries, saying, quote, I could not and did not want to believe what was going on. As soon as I saw my wife's body, I felt everything was over. The whole world seemed to crash down on me. All I could think about was my children." End quote. It was incomprehensible to Soo-young that his wife's nude body had been found in a Bedford-Stuyvesant dumpster riddled with stab wounds. There had been 9 in total, and they had killed her several hours before her body had been deposited into the dumpster. The actual location of Soo-ya's murder was unknown. It's also unknown why her killer chose to abandon her body in Bedford-Stuyvesant. After all, she'd last been seen miles away in an entirely different borough, Queens. Had she been abducted? Had her killer taken her life in Queens and waited until well after dark to drive her body to the high-crime neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant and abandon it there? These are questions that have never been answered. It's worth noting here, though, that Soo-ya did have a connection to Brooklyn's Bushwick neighborhood, which is adjacent to the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood.
Okay.
As we mentioned earlier, one of the Kim family's 2 stores was located in Bushwick, and they spent a lot of time there, and Bushwick and Bedford-Stuyvesant are adjacent neighborhoods.
Okay, so that at least gives her a reason to be somewhat closer.
Right, she had a tie to the neighborhood next door. Had she gone there trying to shop, or had somebody taken her there from Queens? There are a lot of questions with this case, and basically none of them have been answered. Still, I'm not sure how or even whether her connection to that next-door neighborhood plays into where her body was found. In any case, the medical examiner found no evidence of sexual assault during Soo-ya's autopsy, but of course that doesn't rule out the possibility of her killer potentially having been sexually motivated. The fact that her body was unclothed when found suggests that a sexual motive may have driven the killer despite there being no signs of penetrative assault.
Yeah, I think the wording there is pretty important, the penetrative assault. I mean, normally when people think about sexual assault, they do think of that action, but there are other forms of it.
Definitely. We've discussed that in past episodes. Not all sexually motivated killers are going to perform what we would think of as traditional rape when it comes to their victim. A killer can be sexually motivated and never sexually penetrate the victim's body.
Yeah.
As Soo-young struggled to grasp the devastating and confusing situation, investigators quickly zeroed in on a significant person of interest. And Scott, I bet you can guess who that was without me even saying.
So naturally, my mind would go to Soo-young, but you already said that he was at work. So the next person that comes up would be the last person to see her or come into contact with her, which would be the security guard.
Right. Naturally, after the vehicle info Joe, the security guard, had given investigators turned out to be a bust, investigators wondered whether he'd perhaps made it and the entire story about the suspect at the dumpster up in order to deflect suspicion from himself.
I mean, it would be very convenient, and the fact that it only came to one just would have been a stroke of dumb luck to him.
Right, and one of the first things investigators had noticed was that the dumpster Soo-ya's body had been found in was not visible from the street. This meant that whoever had disposed of her body there had been familiar with the area, and who could possibly be more familiar than the security guard paid to patrol the property alone at night? Investigators questioned Joe at length and asked him to participate in a polygraph exam. He was fully cooperative, even with the polygraph. As we know, polygraphs are pseudoscientific at best, but for the record, Joe did pass the examination, showing no signs of deception. Eventually, investigators' inquiry into Joe turned into another dead end. They were reasonably sure he hadn't had anything to do with Soo-ya's murder. Maybe he'd just gotten the partial license plate number wrong. He'd only gotten a quick look at it, and there'd been a lot going on at the time. It's not difficult to imagine him mixing up such a detail in the grand scheme of the situation.
No, I know a lot of security guards don't spend a lot of time looking at plates or memorizing plates or dealing with them. It depends on what kind of properties you're protecting generally. So just a quick flash of a license plate, most people probably won't remember that unless it's a very specific vanity plate.
Right. Additionally, it's very possible that the tag Joe saw on the car didn't belong to that vehicle at all. It might have been a stolen plate, which would mean that if investigators searched for a blue Nissan with that same partial tag character combination, they would get no useful results. If they happened to find a blue Nissan that had that partial character combination, it would be unrelated, like it seems that college student's car was. In a context like this, the plate number is really only useful if the plate in question is registered to the vehicle in question. So, days passed without a suspect. then weeks, and eventually years. By the time Soo-ya's murder had gone unsolved for nearly 2 years, Soo-young couldn't stand life in New York any longer. Without Soo-ya, the business they'd built together had become a sort of prison rather than the source of pride it had once been. Everything in their stores reminded him of her, and it was unbearable. In 1993, he held a going-out-of-business sale, liquidating their store's stock before shuttering their doors and windows one last time. He and his sons then left New York, returning to South Korea. There, Soo-young did his best to pick up the pieces of his life and continue for his sons' sakes. At the time of this recording, more than 30 years later, Soo-ya's case remains unsolved. No suspect has ever been named in relation to her murder, but in recent times, investigators have considered her case in possible relation to the killings committed by a notorious, recently identified New York City serial killer. More on that next. And now, back to Soo-ya's story. Soo-ya's case is, to the best of public knowledge, decidedly cold. More than 30 years have passed since her body was discovered abandoned in a Brooklyn dumpster, and no suspect has ever been named. Outside of the 1990s Unsolved Mysteries segment covering her case, her murder has received staggeringly little media coverage. However, in August of 2023, her name made the news for the first time in decades when police finally ID'd a notorious New York serial killer. I'm talking about Rex Heuermann, or as he was known for years, the Long Island serial killer or the Gilgo Beach serial killer. Heuermann, who's 61 years old at the time of this recording, has just recently been charged with the murders of 7 New York women who he allegedly killed during the 1990s and 2000s. According to an article by Mary Murphy for Pix 11 News, Soo-ya's case is one of several cases that investigators have recently reviewed for any possible connections to Heuermann. And there are some reasons to wonder whether he may have been involved in Soo-ya's death. For starters, she was a petite woman, and Heuermann is known to have sought out and targeted petite female victims. Secondly, Scott, you know how back in 1991, investigators followed that lead on the car and found that it belonged to a student at the CW Post-College campus in Long Island?
Yes.
Well, according to that Pix 11 News article, Heuermann is a graduate of another college that's located just a single minute's drive from that campus, so he was familiar with that area, which perhaps raises the question, had he been frequenting the area at the time of Soo-ya's murder, and might he somehow have access to that car after all?
I would be surprised if he had accessed the vehicle, but it's definitely compelling enough to look into.
Right, it's probably a long shot, but when a case has been cold for more than 30 years, even long shot possibilities may be worth considering, especially since Heuermann is alleged to have already been actively killing in the early 90s. Now, when it comes to Heuermann's physical description versus that of the suspect in Soo-ya's case, well, Heuermann is a white male with blue eyes, and he was in his mid-20s when Soo-ya was murdered, just like her killer is believed to have been. Heuermann's hair is brown, although I don't know what color it may have been back in 1991. Perhaps it was lighter. Photos from his early adulthood show that he was once slender and did wear glasses, but there's a problem. Heuermann is significantly taller than the suspect in Soo-ya's case is estimated to have been.
Okay.
According to the Unsolved Mysteries episode on Soo-ya's case, her killer is believed to have been approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall. However, Heuermann is almost a foot taller than that, at 6 feet 4 inches tall.
Yeah, he'd be noticeably taller than that. It's a pretty staggering misjudgment of height.
Yes, staggering is the right word. While witness descriptions can sometimes veer pretty far from the truth, especially in high-stress situations, it seems really unlikely that anyone would mistake an extremely tall man like Heuermann for being below average in height.
Even I would look at somebody that's 6'4" and go, that's a tall person.
Right, and especially since, remember, Joe, the security guard, engaged with the suspect up close and face-to-face. They had a conversation, they exchanged that $20 bill. It wasn't as if Joe had only seen him from a distance or just for a fleeting moment. They'd had a whole interaction. Additionally, Soo-ya's case doesn't match Heuermann's known MO. To the best of public knowledge, Heuermann targeted sex workers exclusively, luring them to meetings under the guise of being a client and then murdering them. Additionally, he's alleged to have dismembered many of his victims' bodies, and rather than disposing of them in dumpsters, as his little nicknames imply, he buried them at a beach. But Soo-ya wasn't a sex worker and didn't lead a high-risk lifestyle. It would be very risky to target her compared to a woman who's easy to get alone, like a sex worker.
Yeah, the thing that stands out is that it was the early 90s. It was towards the beginning of his known killings. So if that were the case, I wouldn't expect him to have a standardized or very methodical MO for his killings. And I could see him branching further away as he's narrowing down his focus.
Perhaps, like if it was a crime of opportunity and he just decided in the moment to commit it. It is true that killers' preferences and MOs are not immutable characteristics that can and do change over time, but there are a lot of differences here. Between those differences and the significant height difference we just discussed, I personally feel it's unlikely that Huberman had anything to do with Soo-ya's murder.
No, I think it's good that they looked into him and that they've investigated him.
Yeah.
But it's not cohesive enough to really sell me on the theory.
Right. However, Huberman is not the only New York serial killer who's been the subject of speculation in relation to this case. While researching Soo-ya's case, resources were pretty slim. Her story didn't receive much coverage at the time when it happened, and besides the Unsolved Mysteries episode, which is by far the most comprehensive piece of media coverage available, it's received almost no news coverage in the years since. Nonetheless, thanks to that Unsolved Mysteries episode, I was able to find people talking about her case in a couple places online, and I noticed that another serial killer, not Huberman, was mentioned repeatedly. Now, just to be clear, when I say mentioned repeatedly, I'm just talking about everyday people discussing online. This isn't an official law enforcement statement or anything like that.
The quote-unquote armchair detectives?
Right.
They can do some great work sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes. So, the name of that man was Joel Rifkin, and he was a serial killer and lifelong New Yorker whose homicidal crimes spanned from 1989 to 1993. He's about the same age as Huberman and is a blue-eyed, glasses-wearing white male, and that's not where the similarities end. In fact, the two killers are remarkably alike, even down to their brown hair. Both targeted vulnerable sex workers, and both were known to strangle and dismember their victims.
Okay.
So, Soo-ya was decidedly not the kind of victim that either of these men were known to target. Even though, what about Rifkin's physical characteristics versus the suspects? Well, there's a significant discrepancy. Just like with Huberman, he is much taller. Rifkin is 6 feet 2 inches tall, which is significantly taller than Soo-ya's killer's estimated height of 5 feet 6 inches. Again, we're talking at a significantly above average height versus a below average height.
Really disappointing that they keep falling into that same category.
Right. Much like with Huberman, I don't personally believe that Rifkin is likely to have been Soo-ya's killer. It's not just the height difference or the brown hair, although those things, mostly the height difference, are significant. It's largely the fact that Soo-ya's murder was different than their known crimes in almost every detail. If not either of these notorious killers, though, then who? One hint as to the possible identity of Soo-ya's killer came from the scene and has already been mentioned. I'm talking about the fact that the dumpster her body was found in wasn't visible from the street. This means that whoever killed her was likely familiar with the neighborhood where they abandoned her body. This could mean that her killer was an established resident of the neighborhood or that they were someone who frequented it in the course of their work. That Unsolved Mysteries episode mentions investigators theorizing that her killer might have been a taxi or delivery driver, for example. Of course, there's no shortage of drivers in such a large city, nor, for that matter, was there any shortage of homicides in New York in the early 90s. Crime rates in New York City have improved drastically in the decades since, making it one of the safest large cities in the U.S. However, back in 1991, things were different. Crime rates had just peaked and were only beginning to decline. It would take many years for them to reach the comparatively low levels the city experiences today. According to reporting from the Bureau of Criminal Justice Statistics, in 1991, the homicide rate in New York City was 14.24 victims per every 100,000 residents. In comparison, by 2018, the homicide rate in New York City was down to just 2.88 victims per every 100,000 residents.
Yeah, 14 is high, especially when we're thinking about like just the last episode we did when it was 4. for every 100,000 Texans.
Right. Well, that's the statewide average in Texas in more modern times. But yeah, the crime rate in New York City was high. When I see that number, 14.24 per every 100,000 residents, to me, I think, oh, that must be a city somewhere in the South, because that's where I'm used to seeing those kind of numbers. But no, this was New York City at that time. Although 0 homicide victims would, of course, be ideal, 2.88 is a very low number no matter how you look at it when compared to other U.S. localities. It's just slightly over half the national average in 2018, which is amazing for a large urban area.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
In total, 2,154 separate homicides were committed in New York City in the year 1991 alone.
That's a lot of homicides.
Yes, it is. That means that Soo-ya's murder was one of thousands that year and represented just a small fraction of the total annual murder toll. This perhaps explains why her murder didn't receive much media coverage back in 1991. The city was overwhelmed with homicide compared to today. However, there's no denying that Soo-ya's murder was unusual. Unlike most homicide victims who die at the hands of someone they know, she was possibly murdered by a stranger.
The biggest piece of evidence that we still haven't really talked about that's going through my head is, of course, the $20 bill. The potential for fingerprints.
I could never find any mention of that being evaluated for evidence.
To me, it seems like one of the only physical connective pieces that you can have to the suspect.
Maybe it was evaluated and we just don't know. This is one of those cases where, unsolved mysteries really did the heavy lifting and we don't have any follow-up reporting to go on and police aren't making any statements, so I really don't know what, if anything, they've done investigation-wise. Now, while researching this episode, I searched through old news archives looking for any other crimes from the time period similar to Soo-ya's. One incident, reported in the New York Daily News in 1987, did catch my attention. According to the article, a 39-year-old woman was washing clothes in her apartment building's laundry room on 44th Street in Queens when she was attacked by a blonde-haired man. The man, a stranger, dragged her to the building's basement where he sexually assaulted her before cutting her throat with a knife and leaving her for dead. Miraculously, the victim was able to exit the basement and summon the strength to seek help even as she was bleeding.
Wow.
Yeah, ultimately, she received life-saving care first by paramedics who had just so happened to be very nearby when the attack occurred, and then from hospital staff. Had they not been so close by, there's a very real chance that she would have died before she could get help, but she didn't. She survived what had been intended to be a fatal attack and described her attacker as a male with blonde hair, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, and wearing a leather jacket. No description of his eye color or approximate age was mentioned in the reporting. This case stood out to me because the victim was a Queens woman about Soo-ya's age and was going about a routine errand when she was attacked by a sexually motivated offender who forced her to an isolated secondary location and attempted to kill her with a knife. And of course, his physical description matches that of Soo-ya's alleged killer.
Yeah, the knife also is very telling because it's very similar methodology.
Yes. Like I mentioned, that incident occurred in 1987, so just 4 years before Soo-ya's murder. I can't help but wonder, might that woman's attacker have been a serial offender who later targeted Soo-ya, perhaps abducting her while she went about her day? If so, had he stabbed her 9 times in an attempt to be thorough, having learned from that 1987 experience where his victim had survived a single knife wound?
That was one of my questions right off the bat was, did this attack happen before or after? And it happening before. Definitely leads me to think that that could have been an evolution.
Sure. Now, in a large city like New York, there are certain to be many blonde-haired violent sex offenders. There are millions of people there. He's not going to be the only one. Still, I wish I knew more about the investigation that followed the 1987 attack and whether the offender was ever identified. Unfortunately, though, I was unable to locate any follow-up reporting. And the fact is, there could be any number of similar events that happened in the 80s and early 90s in Queens that I simply don't know about. This one just so happened to be reported upon at the time because of the victim's miraculous survival, and I found the reporting in old newspaper archives. In the modern day, the possibility, however tenuous, of Soo-ya's case possibly being linked to a serial killer has finally resulted in some media coverage after decades of silence. even if the coverage has consisted only of a few bylines in a larger article. It's better than nothing, and if the discovery of a notorious serial killer's true identity prompts investigators to take a fresh look at Soo-ya's case, well, that's encouraging. Perhaps answers will finally be found, even if they have nothing to do with the serial killers we've just discussed. Someone, whether a serial killer or not, killed Soo-ya in the prime of her life, leaving her young sons with only early childhood memories of a mother who'd loved them and of a father who'd been happy. More than 30 years have passed since Soo-ya's murder, and her case has received little in the way of attention since then. While that's unfortunate, it also means that there very well may be someone out there with information that they never realized could be tremendously valuable to investigators. So please take a look at the suspect sketch. We've posted it on our website, the link is in the show notes. And if you know anything about the murder of Soo-ya Kim, please contact the NYPD Crime Stoppers tip line at 1-800-577-8477. You may remain anonymous if you wish. And if you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved homicide of Diana Bakari. Her case isn't related to Soo-ya's, but both cases involve the little-known murders of women whose remains were callously discarded in dumpsters. We aired our episode on Diana's case in March of 2024. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok at Last Seen Alive Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Soo-ya's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.